This is Father Patrick Briscoe.
And this is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all who support us. If you enjoy our show, please consider making a monthly donation to our project on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. Father Bonaventure, we are here to talk about one of the world's most pressing questions.
Caramba.
The difference between guilt and shame.
Fantastic.
Now, as a convert, I wonder if you have a particular perspective on the phenomenon known as Catholic guilt. What you make of that, broadly speaking.
Well, it's an Irish thing, right?
I think so.
So, because I don't generally associate with like Italians. Not sure why that is. But the Irish...
They don't seem to have much of it.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they do. It's hidden. I was always told there's a lot of Catholic guilt. But I mean, I came from a Calvinist background. So like you're always kind of guilty. You know that. But there was this sense of Catholics always feeling guilty, especially the Irish Catholics. So I heard about it. I was excited to be a part of it. But to be honest, I didn't feel a lot of it, you know?
It does. So it does seem like it's a thing that people talk about a lot.
Right. That's what
Catholics,
it means, though. Right? When you grew up with this, did you have a sense of what the phenomenon was here? It's pointing at?
So it seemed basic. Catholic guilt basically seemed to be the manifestation of the fact that you have a conscience.
Yes.
As a human being, and when
to Americans, you disobeyed it.
Yeah, exactly. When people say, oh, it's my Catholic guilt acting up. Really, what they mean is, I did something bad.
I've been sinning again.
Exactly. Yeah. And the knowledge, the unerasable knowledge of the moral law, which God imparted to me as a human being, spoke up from within.
Yeah, the voice
against me. Yeah. So I think that's basically what most people mean when they say Catholic guilt.
That seems right. The lack of freedom in all sorts of ways, and then the self-condemnation. That you shouldn't, apparently, according to them, be partaken.
So I do think there's something fundamental here. So I wanted to toss this out as we start getting into this difference here, because I think there's a lot to be said, actually, about guilt and shame in the moral life, what they are, to maybe make a distinction that some listeners might not have thought of, because I do think they should be considered differently. And that by making a distinction, we can get some clarity here, but also to see how then guilt and shame, respectively, influence the moral life. So I think that's all very important. So I want to start here. I think that guilt is rooted in what we have done. We're already just kind of sussing that out a bit, right? We're saying I feel badly because I have sinned.
Yep.
So my impression of guilt is that it's rooted in an action, but maybe that's not your view.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the hallmarks of 20th century analytic philosophy, American and Anglo-American philosophy, is to look at how we use language, how we use words, to give us realities in a way. And I think this is true for guilt, right? When most people talk about guilty, you naturally hear about a gavel. And you hear about a judgment.
That's right.
And so you have, what is a judge doing? A judge isn't pronouncing you a bad person, right? He's pronouncing you, you are bad, but he's pronouncing you guilty of some crime, right? And now it's because of whatever reason, but like you are guilty of this. You're not innocent of it. And it isn't like your life. It is a particular action, you could say. So it has this kind of, a thing done that is not you, but reflects you. And this is one of those things where students who commit plagiarism will often say, I want to let you know that even though I did this, I'm guilty. This isn't who I am. And in one way, you're right, but another way, you're deeply wrong.
You're
like
wrong.
it is who you did this.
You did this.
Now you're not a guilty person. You're not guilt. But you are guilty because of the things you've chosen, this sort of thing. So I think guilt is the sense of it's the activities, the actions, whereas shame is more about your person, right?
Yeah, let's pause there. I don't want to get too far into that,
because I think for a while.
But yeah, because I think I think a point that you just made there we should underscore, which is that you are in a way the sum total of your moral actions. This is the whole point of being virtuous. Is that virtue is a good action, right, which perfects the one who does it and makes the possessor good.
A disposition that gives us a capacity and a power, such that when you say you're virtuous, it means that you have a natural disposition and power as a habitus of acting in these particular ways. You haven't yet, walked the old lady across the street or prayed at the right times, but it's a thing that you would do given the right circumstances. It flows out of you. Yeah.
So then, if we're thinking of guilt, and you're saying, well, you are the things you've done that are reprehensible.
Yeah.
To use a heavy word. How is it that isn't actually able to be extracted from your person? Like just draw this home a little bit. What you were saying about the student. No, you. On the one hand, you are actually.
So the thing is, it's true. You are a plagiarist in this case, but you need not be. Right? Like, it's something that can change. It's something that, because it was an action that you are guilty of, but you're not guilty, therefore, in the future of other actions. Like, it will have consequences to you, of course, in all sorts of ways, but that it's a thing that you did, and it's a thing that you have a propensity, perhaps, to do again, but it's something that you can change, right? It's something that you can be forgiven for, right? You don't forgive someone of being a person, right? You forgive a person of their actions because you assume that there's something there that is worth forgiving in that person. Whereas if you were just your bad actions, well, then what are you forgiving? You're forgiving a person for something wrong. So I think the idea of guilt as being associated with the actions, that although they, in a sense, correspond to you and give you a window into who you are, I think all of us have had major conversions, I hope, when you get caught or you catch yourself doing something and say, I don't want to be that kind of person, right? But if you were just your actions, then you would never discover that. That would just be who you were with no way of not knowing that.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think that was worth really driving home, because it allows us then to move into, as you were starting to do, to say that shame is more interiorized, actually. That when we say, I'm ashamed, we're talking about I'm feeling myself badly. I'm feeling badly about myself, or I'm feeling unworthy, or there's some kind of interior aspect of the phenomenon.
Yeah, there's a paradox here, right? In a sense, guilt is more exterior to you because it's about your actions and not your identity, you could say. But it's also more interior because it's an internal disposition. Like, I can declare you guilty, but guilt we generally talk about is like, I accept that. It's an internal feeling, a judgment of me internally. Like we talk about guilty conscience, right? So Dostoevsky talks about these sort of things. Augustine, if you read the Confessions, you have this sort of like nagging sense of guilt. Like, even though I've gotten away with it, there's something pressing, right? Whereas shame is, on the other hand, a generally external phenomenon. Like, someone says to you, shouldn't you be ashamed? Like, if a shame culture is to have other people looking at you and saying, we don't talk to that person. We stay away from that person, like the Amish kind of shaming culture. And yet at the same time, as you say, the internal aspect is, it's about like you. Like, it's not you've done a shameful act, we might say, but it reflects upon you. It's not so much the act that is the target of the approbation,
right?
But it's actually the comment, but rather you're a shameful person who has done a shameful act. So it has in one sense a more external thing, because its fingers pointed at you, a societal kind of appreciation, external judgment in a way, but also in the sense that it's more about you. It's more about the person has caused shame, right? Family shame, that kind of stuff. It's more personal.
Right. Yeah, broadly, I've understood guilt is rooted in actions, right? I've done something bad.
Yep.
And shame being like rooted in identity, the perception that you are yourself bad. So I like nice. What you're doing though, because you're introducing a more nuance than that description, than that distinction allows. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and people use them together, of course. Sometimes you talk about shame and guilt, but I think it's worth distinguishing the sense, because you can have, of course, false guilt. Right? And you can, courtroom, obviously, you can say someone's guilty when they're not. You can have, and this is for the spiritual life, very important, that you don't get a sense of, even though I've been forgiven, I'm still guilty. Like, that sin hasn't, you can imagine this going this way, a guilty conscience in the wrong way because it's ill-formed, or a missing guilt. On the other hand, you could also have shame, of the right kind of shame, in the sense of the society, and this is Paul talks about this with the church, coming to people and coming to, excommunicating, in the sense of saying like,
Right.
we won't tolerate this, and this is a social choice. Where you can also have the sense of, if a society isn't ashamed of things it ought to be, right? So while shame and guilt should relate to each other, I take it that you should be ashamed of things that you're also guilty of doing, right? They should track each other in a way. They can come apart, and in our society, very often they do come apart in horrible ways.
Right. Now, what do you think about this? Sometimes figures or typologies can be helpful as we're kind of distinguishing something. So when I look at the scriptures and I see a figure that I want to assign to guilt, I assign Simon Peter to guilt, right? Simon Peter, who betrays the Lord, he feels guilty for that action, for that deed of betrayal which he has done. And then in Simon Peter's case, that guilt becomes an impetus, a motus, even a motivation to repent. So I think there's something interesting there about guilt and repentance. Whereas shame being, again, as I've understood it, a kind of interior disposition, shame is alienating, it's isolating.
Yes.
This is by the point that you were making about the societal view,
Yes.
the societal perspective on shame. That's where we were aligning there some. I'm inclined to assign that to Judas Iscariot.
I was going to say that's a nice
Right, to say like
typology.
this is what happens when you don't allow when you don't allow that moral value to be added to your action. When you attribute it solely to yourself, you become kind of stuck in it. And I think the shame has a way of doing that, right? It kind of owns you and doesn't allow for the kind of improvement, the betterment that maybe guilt motivates us.
Yeah,
towards.
well, and
So what do you
also-
think about that?
well, and
Simon
also you
Peter
have this- I
versus
like this-
Judas Iscariot.
Yeah, well, and also interesting enough, Judas Iscariot, of course, tries to like fix the shame a bit.
Yes.
Like he goes back to the
Yes,
Judas
he
and tries to give
throws the money
he has
back.
a sense of like,
and-
and he wants the kind of recognition of others, right? So shame has this social dimension to it, and getting back and right, regardless of the internal stuff, right? Whereas the reconciliation he attempts there is a social reconciliation, right? In some fashion that people will give. Whereas the St. Peter's, right, he doesn't go and search this. There's a very internal kind of thing. There's but the Lord has to reconcile him away from others, right? That kind of conversation he has. And that's where guilt has this, now this is back to the more internal thing, guilt has this deep internal wound because it's something that you have done. Your deeds you see are wrong, but it's still you. And so there has to be a reconciliation between you and your actions.
Right.
Right. The guilty verdict has been pronounced by either you or someone else on you and you. Whereas with shame, it's more about the social recognition, and that can be healed in this way. But guilt is in a sense more internal in this way because you have done it to yourself. And this is where, the Aristotelian, the tradition has the sense that when you commit sin, who have you really harmed? Right. You have ultimately,
Everyone.
although you've harmed everyone and God, of course, but also yourself. Like if you say, we shouldn't sin because, then it will lead to X. No, you shouldn't, because it makes you a bad person,
Right.
because it harms you.
Right.
And then the sense of this guilt internalizing that. So I like the typology of Judas and Peter because you have a social reconciliation attempt, right? And then you have an internal personal reconciliation attempt. And social recognition you can get if you can manipulate.
Right.
Right? Whereas the personal one,
Yes.
before you and God,
Yes.
you can't. Ultimately, guilt has to be something that demands a radical forgiveness, right? In a way that shame, if you just wait long enough, perhaps the society will come around.
Now let's move back a little bit further in the scripture to Genesis, where we see an important reference to shame.
Oh, yeah.
Right, we talk about Adam and Eve when they're first created. They're living in harmony with creation. They're naked without shame, and then sin enters in, and suddenly they're ashamed of their nakedness.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, and that's...
And can we square that with
it's
the
nice.
distinction that we've been making
Well, it's
here?
nice because in a way, so you can be guilty and no one can notice it. Right? You can have a guilty conscience, and I think many people do kind of wander through this, and that's why they need to be dealt with, but you don't notice it. But if you're a shameful person, right? Everyone knows. Like there's a sense of people are looking,
There's
you're
like a
sneering,
heaviness or
just sort of
sorrow,
like
right.
you're just I mean, we might be generous people. We don't do the shaming thing that we've done before in the past, you could say. But like society is not. Society might get along with some shame. Whereas with guilt is like is the internal thing such that it's unless you reveal it to someone. This is where confession is important. This is where going to the Lord is important. You could just be penned up and you can die with it. Whereas shame, you're going to have to, if you're going to exist in society, you're going to have to deal with it. So that's what when you talk about the shame of, so there's guilt, of course, the culpa, but the shame is the kind of dealing with their nakedness. And the Pope John Paul II, of course, in his Wednesday Catechesis talks about the original shame and the kind of coverings. Like they try to cover up externals regarding the internals such that, and to be okay with each other. So that's a very external kind of, that's a shame motivation, whereas it's not like they're apologizing to each other. They still need to get right with the Lord. Right? But they're going to try to solve the shame problem of being the people that have done wrong, right, with each other by these kind of garments. And the Lord's going to provide different garments for them and such. But they still, even though they have the garments, the Lord still needs to provide something to deal with the guilt. And that's what, of course, the pointing with the early proto-evangelion, like the serpent and all this kind of stuff. Right. So I take it that the distinction, again, even though sin has both components, the shame and the guilt are both important, and they need to be dealt with in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Your emphasis here, because I'd be inclined to say like, well, guilt is a good thing, but shame is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Because guilt, as we were kind of setting up, leads to repentance in important ways, I think, whereas shame, again, is more isolating, more alienating, so it's more difficult to see that as a good thing. However, mm-hmm. insofar as you're attentive to it, right, you can recognize the lies about your identity, I suppose, through this proper sense of shame. So maybe let's refine this a little bit. Is there a kind of shame that you think is really a good thing? Can we distinguish between good and bad shame? And same, can we make that distinction between good and bad guilt?
Well, I think I think that's right. So good and bad shame, I take it, is shame that's aimed at the right kind of acts. So we all need help, one, to learn the moral law. This is why we don't just, like, when you're a kid, you expect God to tell you everything directly, right? Your parents are there, and what do your parents do? They say things like, you should be ashamed of yourself. And the kid doesn't say, like, that's bad shaming, because all shaming is bad. Yeah. No, shaming has this social function of trying to bring, you could say, visibly what we should also feel guilty about. Because oftentimes, for instance, the shame and guilt have the same actions, but it's the question of the reconciliation mediated with them.
Like, it's the most devastating line that parents can offer their children, right? Which is that I'm disappointed in you. And you just feel the shame.
Well, that's
right. I suppose it's something like watching, Japanese families as they
So I remember taking a course on Japan. Now I'm a master. But in high school, our senior principal, our president, Brother Thomas Lack, he was a De La Sallian brother, and Father Patrick was trained by De La Sallians, La Sallian brothers as well, Christian brothers, and he was a Japanese scholar. And so he gave a course on Japan, and I found it was actually for like people that were in the football team that needed one more course to pass out, and I was doing well, and so he asked me, like, are you sure you want to take this course? And I'm like, yeah, I want to learn about Japan. But one of the things that always struck me is learning about the Japanese culture, at least in 2002, was that we had this book about Japan today, or the Japanese today, and had this picture of a family in front of a giant board that had names and scores. And it was the exam entering college, and you would not find out your results in a little envelope like we would here that you could privately look at in your room or something and not tell anyone unless they had to, sort of thing. But you would have to go and look at a leaderboard, basically. It's like golf. And look at where, and then the names would be revealed, and your whole family and everyone would know how you did as a family.
I had teachers that would do that. They would post grades, with your name
right.
and the grade
why did they do
the
that?
door.
Because they were evil? No, I think it's because they understood that
here's what it is.
Exactly.
This is the world.
Yeah, and it does, and to inculcate hopefully an internalization of good and bad. Sometimes through, just like when you grow up, you train people through carrots and sticks. I think shame has this kind of social function that is not as deep as guilt. Like, we couldn't get along with just shame. Because you can always say, my culture doesn't appreciate this, but I don't feel bad about it.
Right.
And ultimately, you have to have that.
So try. How about this analogy? So guilt is kind of like the check engine light coming on in your car, right?
Yeah,
It's
I like
coming
that.
on from within, and
Change the flat tire.
shame and shame as well. It could be a flat tire, right? Or someone else. I was thinking someone else walking up to you and saying, like, "Hey, you gotta look at this about your car."
Right.
Like you should know this about your car. You should understand that the
Yes.
noise that it's making is something you need to address. But when someone else says, "Oh, you have to address that noise," then you're you're really kind of forced to take a look at it in a different way.
Yeah, I like that. It's a social kind of the social aspect of sin, you could say, or the trying to reconcile it, of course, because you're trying to say, look, you should be ashamed, or that's a shameful thing, or you've brought shame upon the family, like you've brought a tarnish to the externals. In a way that, for instance, like when you sin, oftentimes your sin might have only an effect on you and your relationship with God.
So I feel like we've done a pretty good job in this episode so far of saying what the value to these things are, maybe guilt or shame, things that would be things that people might be inclined to dismiss or to see, oh, that's just kind of an emotional reaction to something that I don't really need to pay attention to. No, you should pay attention to these two principles. They're more than just feelings. Are there instances where they go overboard, where guilt actually needs to be reined in, where shame needs to be addressed in a kind of meaningful way? But what does that look like if there's a little bit of excess on the other side?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think obviously again you need both of them, I would say, and they both serve particular functions, and they should kind of track each other. Like you should be ashamed of things that you're guilty of, and you should be and guilt comes up things that are ashamed. As long as the thing is, guilt can go wrong because it's internal.
Right.
It has that you can condemn yourself of things you ought not to be guilty of, right? So if you're, for instance, if you have a particularly sensitive or scrupulous conscience or something, and you can hold yourself accountable and never be forgiven and never just keep telling yourself, I'm guilty of this, because there's no one else that's going to tell you, like, other than God and the priest, hopefully in confession, you're forgiven, right? Because guilt has that kind of internal, like, I have to manifest it to someone, right? So one is you can be overboard in the sense of holding yourself guilty and accountable for things that have been forgiven. And I think people can struggle with this because it takes faith to trust in God's love and His forgiveness when distributed in particular ways, like through the sacrament of confession and such. On the other hand, shame, in a sense, shame is you can have the other extreme. Instead of being overly shameful, I doubt that we'll have any culture like that. But we can get a culture that isn't ashamed, and people that aren't ashamed when they ought to be in particular actions.
That's exactly what I was
thinking. And then what that
yeah.
does, I take it, is it starts to degrade the guilt. Because guilt and shame kind of stick each other. They should have some relation. Your social life and your internal life should be somewhat cohesive. And so when shame starts to be taken off of something, then you wonder, oh, am I just being guilty about this?
Right.
But it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great danger today, where the campaign to normalize weird sex stuff is just all around us. And instead, we need to be very clear that we do think weird sex stuff is embarrassing, and we do in fact want to shame people for willing, and chosen intentional participation in weird.
Well,
weird
and I
sex
think shame
stuff.
is hard. Guilt is easy for us, not just as Catholics and Westerners because of tradition, but shame is I think harder because it demands a public morality.
Right.
So you shame
Yeah,
people
there's a
not because of
contest
choice
over
about
that.
like you picked the wrong color or you're not wearing matching socks, but like you have done wrong. That's why we're not just shaming you for political gain.
Right.
We're shaming you because you're bringing damage to our society. And our society, as we get more uncomfortable with a public general morality, right? Shame doesn't have its motor anymore. We're likely to just drop down, except for the most extreme things, and you just keep pushing the line back on that.
Yeah,
so I think
that's right.
I think if to be attentive, and now I don't know how we do this, but to be attentive to shame again as an important element, not only to your own family growing up, but as a society, is something we should try to recover in a fashion. I'm not saying that this has to go in the sense of like putting people in the stocks. And I remember I was in Poland this summer, and they had these little chains on the side of two pillars by a big marketplace door. And this is where, if you were caught in adultery, two of you were shackled up there on two different sides, and people would look at you and jeer and throw things. And that's like
Fantastic.
super shame, right? Super shameful. Maybe we don't do that, but the idea that actually you don't fool yourself if you think that you're going to have internal guilt in the right place if you don't have external shame in the right place.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, Father Bonaventure, if someone's struggling with shame about past sins, you made this a beautiful appeal to God's mercy just now. What should someone do? I guess this should also be said for guilt too. If you're struggling with shame or guilt that you feel like you can't overcome, what ought you to do in Christian life?
Well, guilt. What dealing with guilt is to one, confess and make sure you've confessed. And honestly, share yourself, your actions, and ask them to be forgiven from the Lord in the confession. It's fine, and also with others. I think it's not like confessing with others, but if you have to apologize, not let the sun go down your anger. Dilexit Nos, the new encyclical from Pope Francis, talks about how we should never be ashamed of going out and asking for forgiveness from others, and I think that's important. So the guilt does also it slips into this social dimension, but the shame aspect, I think we have to be very careful about what the target or the measure of shame is. Like, we should ask ourselves, if we feel particularly ashamed of something, we might ask someone, because that's more of a social thing, to check in and find out if we're misguided. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably ashamed of things either rightly so, or you perhaps might be ashamed of something that, isn't as big a deal, right? Whereas many people haven't even thought about it. Let's put it this way. If you've thought about and can't get over being ashamed, you probably should trust in the mercy of God and realize and ask yourself, do people interact with me as shameful, right? Or is it me projecting those social relations outward?
I do think in both instances, a kind of overly burdensome guilt, an overly burdensome shame are the result of an over-internalization. And that's why I think your counsel is so valuable
from others and God.
To be exteriorized, right? To ask someone, hey, what do you think about this? Someone that's valuable. So there could be a kind of touch point, a checkpoint with reality beyond yourself, because otherwise we just become we become abstracted beyond things as they really are.
And we're great deceivers. This is Augustine's insight into us. We're masters of self-deception, such that we can think that we ought not to be guilty about something that we are guilty of. We can think that we should be ashamed of something that we're not ashamed of. Like, some people are ashamed of you hear about this, their Christianity or something, and it's like, you shouldn't be ashamed of that.
Right.
But other people aren't ashamed of anything. And you think, what, actually, you should be ashamed of saying those things or treating people in those particular ways. Like, it's not a crime. We're not going to call the police on you. You might not confess, but you shouldn't. This is not a way you should interact in this particular way, or say these things about the Mother of God, for instance. Like, these are, and you don't. The nice part with shame is it doesn't have the same kind of full-on punch to the heart. Like, you're guilty. It's like, just that you should be ashamed of yourself,
right.
And you can have this kind of, now I can reconcile socially. I can fix that.
Right.
Whereas guilt, I have to realize something I've done.
We're Christians. We want to live in a Christian society, and living in Christian society means that there are parameters that we're working in, and guilt and shame, I think, are very valuable because they help us adapt to make sure we're
navigate socially
within those boundaries.
Yeah, the life of flourishing, because they can be, of course, they're negative emotions. You could say negative judgments, negative reactions, but they're for the purpose of redemption, right? You recognize your guilt so that you may be forgiven and find reconciliation there, and you recognize shame such that you might change your social relations and your external behaviors, such that you can actually bring some sort of flourishing of your name and your family. This is very important for the biblical tradition about one's name,
right? And
we have a name as Christians that we don't want to bring shame and disrepute to.
Well, that's a very hopeful note to end things on, I think. So turning to you, the listener, the viewer, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Godsplaining. We hope that you would follow our project if you haven't already. Like and subscribe to Godsplaining across all of our social media channels, across wherever you listen to your podcast. Leave comments in this episode. What do you think about guilt? What do you think about shame? Is it something you're struggling with? We love hearing from you. We love your take on this episode. We do tune into those comments and take them seriously. Follow us over at godsplaining.org. Visit our website, that is, to find information about upcoming Godsplaining events. We do have a special announcement for you here. We are going to be having a retreat this summer in Providence, Rhode Island. That will be an all-comers retreat. Any listener is welcome to join us. That's going to be quite the event. Providence in June, which is when this retreat is going to be. Providence in June has to be one of the nicest places in the continental U.S. I just think Rhode Island is at its best in June.
That's fair. That's fair.
So you should really think about coming. So all the information about that will be found for you over at godsplaining.org. While you're there at godsplaining.org, you can check out our merch shop, get something cool to wear at the Godsplaining All Comers Retreat in Providence in June. Friends, please pray for us. We ask that you would continue to support us through your prayers. If you'd like to make a donation to us, become a Patreon monthly supporter. And please know that we are praying for you. God bless.
Father Bonaventure, if you had to choose between getting Warby Parker glasses, subscribing to a YouTube channel, or flossing your teeth, what would you choose?
Oof. I guess, to be honest, subscribing to a YouTube channel.
See, folks, it's not as bad as flossing your teeth or getting Warby Parker glasses. Please subscribe to Godsplaining. Cheers.